So we've been on this journey for several weeks now about focus, like bringing our life into focus. What are the things that we need to be focused on, first as individuals, because that's most important, right? And then collectively as a church, what's our focus need to be as we go forward, right? Because I believe that if we can get individually, if we can get our purpose, our focus, right, our purpose in focus, right, then collectively we come together and we work together as a church. Our focus as a church will be exactly what God has intended for it to be. So this is our last Sunday on this series, and we've been in Colossians. Colossians chapter 3 is kind of been our theme verse as we've gone through the series, right? And it simply says this: that since then you've been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. Right? That, man, let's just be focused on the things that matter. Not the things that matter to us, because we will jack something up in a second. Right? But what are the things that matter to God, for you, for me, for our church? And when that happens, I'm telling you, you're going to see some awesome things begin to unwrap. We're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 17 today. 1 Samuel chapter 17, and we'll be talking about a portion of a story that may be the first Bible story, Bible lesson that you ever learned in church. 1 Samuel, chapter 17, verse 50. And I'm just going to read one piece of scripture out of this story, and we'll talk about the story more as we go through the day. All right, but 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 50, and it says this: So David, King David, right, shepherd boy David, so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. So this is maybe towards the back end of this story. But what we do know, and I'll share just a little bit, maybe if you don't know, but at this point, David has been anointed king. Samuel has already anointed David king, right? But he's not yet serving, because King Saul is still the king over Israel. Right? And so a lot of what David has been tasked with, he's going back and forth from home to the battlefield. Right? Back and forth. Right? He's helping his brothers, he's serving his brothers, he's taking food to his brothers. So he's really going back and forth, right? And he's not necessarily become and filled that role as king yet, but that's coming. Right? And we know the story that there was a huge Philistine giant. He was 9 foot, and he was 9 foot 9 inches tall. Right? They said that his armor alone that he wore was 125 pounds. Right? They said the sword that he took was 15 pounds in itself. Right? And for 40 days, it was going back and forth with the Philistine army and the Israelite army. They were going back and forth, and every morning, this Philistine giant would come to the battlefield and start calling out the Israelites. He would do that in the morning, and then he would come back in the afternoon, the evening, and he would call them out again. Who's going to come forth? Who's going to come forth and fight me? Right? Because, and then it said that, because I want to take you all as slaves. He did that every morning. He did that every afternoon for 40 days until he has an encounter with David. And we're going to start, and we're going to get to and talk a little bit about that. But I don't know if you're like me, but men, I think in general, we're not good communicators. Can we agree to that? All right. In general, we are not the best communicators. At my house, I've really had to work for the past 25 years, right, to get better at communication with my wife, with our family. I've used up all of my words by the time I get home most days. Right? I just want to be right? Just by myself, in my soft clothes, just hanging out. Right? But sometimes, right, there's something that's actually we gotta communicate about. And guys, I don't know if you're like me, hopefully not. But like sometimes if Shannon's got something really important to tell me, it's better if she'll just go ahead and tell me how it ends. Right? Just tell me how it ends, all right? Because once I know that everything's okay, right? That both of us don't have to go to the school this time, or that, nobody's hurt, everything's all right, then we can go back and I can understand and listen better to the details. Right? But it always helps me to know if I know how the story ends. Right? It's different. It's different if you know how it ends. You react different. Right? You react if you know how things are going to happen. I remember one time me and Preston were going to some basketball training, and we were driving and we were coming down the road that's, I don't know that it matters, but where the movie theater is, all right? And we were going down there, and there was a Tahoe in front of us. And we're going there just minding our own business, talking, and all of a sudden this Tahoe just slams on his brakes. I mean, out of nowhere, there was no reason for him to stop, but he just slammed on his brakes, right? So here we are, I'm trying to react, right? I do the daddy arm, right? And man, we're braking hard, and we end up over in the ditch so we don't hit this Tahoe. And, you look at Preston, and, he was all a bit of 8 or 9, his eyes wide open. I'll never forget what he said. He said, "Daddy, that could have ended up a whole lot different. A whole lot different." How many of you know this morning there's some things in your life that could have ended up a whole lot different? Right? If that drunk driver hadn't swerved at the right time, right? And that angel just pulled that car over, things could have ended up a whole lot different. Right? If you gotten stopped by the police at the right time in college, things could have ended up a whole lot different. Right? And it's some of us, it's not that we did anything wrong, we just didn't get caught. Can we say that? If we had just been at the wrong place at the wrong time, it could have ended up a whole lot different. Right? So it's funny now, but David never had the opportunity to read Samuel 17:50. Right? It's different when you know how it ends. So we can shout and high five about this story, but David was shaking. Right? David was shaking in his sandals, right? Holding a sling, trembling, wondering how this story was going to end. Right? And you've not read Samuel 17:50 about the situation in your life, maybe. Right? You're still looking at a giant that's so much bigger than you. Right? And since we know how David's story ends, I want to spend a few minutes today thinking about how it could have ended. Because it could have ended a whole lot different. Right? Had I gone to that one school and married that one girl, it could have ended a whole lot worse for Shannon. Pay for that one. But think about it. There's so many things circumstantial in your life that could have ended up a whole lot different. If David had made some different decisions, the story ends a whole lot different. We're going to talk about some of those, right? God is writing your story, church, right now. Right? God is writing your story for your family right now. God is writing your story for this season of your life right now. God is writing the story for Hickory Grove right now. Right? So although we know that Goliath goes down, David has to do it in the face of what for him was a lot of uncertainty. Right? Yet no matter how many sermons you hear about David and Goliath, and I'm sure you've heard many, right? I think we've got to recognize that there are at least 3 things that I'm going to point out today that David had to face even before he got to Goliath. And if any of these 3 things had worked out differently, guess what? It could have ended up a whole lot different. But number one, David had to face the ordinary. Right? David had to face the ordinary. You see, because if David would have been a typical teenager, right, when his father came and said, right, keep in mind, David's only 17 when he kills Goliath. My son is 17. Okay? He's 17 when he kills Goliath. Right? So I can just imagine if he had a response, right, to his father Jesse's instruction when Jesse said, I want you to run these snacks down to your brothers at the battlefield. If David had rolled his eyes, it's like, geez, Dad, seriously? Are we seriously going to do this? Dad, I'm the future king here. Hey, if that would have been his response, right? Because understand, Samuel's already anointed David. He already knows he has a great future. But now, if David refuses to be faithful in the present because he's too focused on his future, the story ends a whole lot different. But watch how the story could have gone. It could have been a whole lot different. Jesse wakes David up that morning. He says, I got a task for you. I want you to run the cheese and run the bread down to your brothers on the battle line. They're in the valley of Elah. All right, and they're fighting with Saul. They're fighting the Philistines. What if David was the teenager and he wakes up slowly? All right, David rolls his eyes. All right, David checks his phone. All right, David posts on his Instagram story. All right, the spam account, the fake account. Right, the one that Jesse doesn't follow. See, kids, we know these things. We really do. Says, geez, Dad. Man, my dad makes me sick. Right? He doesn't even recognize and realize who I am. This is ridiculous. I hate my parents. I hate my life. Right? David goes to the battle line, but he gets there 45 minutes late. Right? He gets there after Goliath has already come out, right, to shout his usual defiance. Right? So he didn't know Goliath was on the battle line. So you don't know what day God's going to choose to use you. You don't know what conversation in your life is going to turn things around. You don't know what moment is going to be holy. You don't know when a bush is going to burst into flames and spontaneously combust with the presence of God, right? And the direction for the next step of your life. You don't know this. We don't know these things, right? That's why we got to pursue Christ and pursue God and get in this scripture every day. But if you don't show up and do the ordinary with a good attitude, it could have been a whole lot different. Really? I mean, do you really think they would have taught us this Bible story in Sunday school if it ended up that way? Right? Jesse wakes up David. David gets up. David went down to the battle line with a bad attitude. He dropped off the food. He threw it at his brothers and he went back home. What's that about? Yet it could have ended like that. Right? That could have been the very end of the story. It could have ended up a whole lot different. It could have ended up with David feeling slighted because he was asked to do something that he deemed insignificant. You know who I am? Dad, really? You're asking me to be a delivery boy? To take food to my brothers? Are you serious right now, Dad? Jeez, Dad. Okay. I'll go. It's like I've heard this before. I'll go. I'm not going to run to the battle lines. I'll go, but I don't have to like it. What if it ended like that? Okay, I'll go to church, but I'm not lifting my hands. That's what the weird people do. Right? Okay, I'll go, but we're leaving church as early and as soon as we can. It could have been a whole lot different. Right? So here's what I'm learning is that opportunity presents itself as ordinary. There's not going to be, right, that breakthrough in our life sometimes, right? And understand, right? So we use Goliath a lot in church, right? About the giants, right? So Goliath means anything in church, really. Right? It does. We use it a lot. It could mean we want a good parking space, right? It could mean that we want some healing in our body. We want to stop eating so many chips, right? And Goliath has turned into and can mean anything, really. But in this particular instance, I want us to understand that it means anything that opposes the purpose of God. Anything that opposes the purpose of God. See, he was standing against the people of God, opposing the purpose of God, defying the armies of the living God. That's what Goliath was at this moment. Right? And it usually won't be physical, but before David ever got to the real battle, I'm here to tell you he had to face the ordinary. Parents, there's not going to be one conversation with your kids that's going to change their life. Right? It's going to be picking them up and dropping them off every day. Right? Trying to get them to say more than 3 words at a time. That's going to change their life. 3 words on top of 3 words. On top of 3 words. On top of 3 words. Right? You're not going to have the opportunity to take your son on some trip to Scotland, right, and reenact Braveheart, and all of a sudden he comes out as a mighty warrior of God. It doesn't work like that. Our work is done every day in the ordinary. Right? It's those conversations that I get to have, right? I was telling Jamie this morning that Preston used to have to go to practice over in Concord. And when they put that schedule out, I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be brutal. I get off of work, drive 45 minutes to Concord, 2-hour practice, and at 9 o'clock drive from Concord all the way back to Cramerton. Right? Twice a week. But what I found out at the end of the day, that every Tuesday and every Thursday, I had 2 hours in the car with my son. And he knows when we're together, anything is on the table, any topic is on the table, right? It's the ordinary things. It's the things that we don't see. It's the things that we don't think about, right? That we've got to put one foot in front of another and understand that that's what matters. Right? Listen, Hickory Grove, there's not going to be some seismic event in the life of this church that sets us on a path and blazes us forward. As much as I pray for that, that's probably not going to happen. What's going to happen, right, is 1,000 little ordinary things and tasks and events and us doing the basic fundamental things as a church to be known and to be seen in this community. At that point, right, it's the ordinary. It's the ordinary. We can't, maybe you've met that person, right, that's holding out for a management position. It's not like that. Right? We're going to pick up our cross every day and go out of here and make an impact on this community. Right? We know how the story ends, but he didn't even know there was a giant in the valley of Elam at this point. If he had overlooked the ordinary, man, how the story could have ended. Number 2, David had to seize the opportunity. Right? He couldn't forget about the ordinary task, but David at the point had to seize the opportunity. Right? So then he gets there, right? He does the ordinary, right? He ran to the battle lines. He left his things with the keeper supplies. We learn and we know that David's very responsible. He runs to the battle lines. He's there in position with the attitude to seize that opportunity. And when he hears Goliath shouting, right, and if David goes down like most of us go around and just try to mosey through our day, he's not going to be in the frame of mind to seize that opportunity. And even when he gets there, right, he gives his brothers the food that he brought for him. Right? One of his brothers, we learn in the story, has such a bad attitude that the second thing that David had to deal with, right, before he even got to the real opponent, was the opportunity he had to go through his brother before he got to Goliath. Right? I want to show you this. It's very powerful. Right? How some of us are fighting the wrong battle. We're fighting the wrong battle. We're fighting a preliminary battle and missing the real one. Because when David gets there, he's like, "What's up, guys?" Right? He's new to this. He hadn't been there 40 days, right? And Goliath coming out every morning and every afternoon. Right? He's like, hey guys, what'd I miss? And like, nothing new, David. Right? This giant, this 9-foot giant comes out every day. Right? And he keeps saying the same thing. He keeps telling us, send your best man. I'll kill him and we'll be your slaves. 40 days, 40 nights, he's come with the same thing. But we can't do anything with him. Because, I mean, look at him. Look how big he is. And David's like, look how big he is. Right? I heard the old country preacher, right, said the rest of the army saw Goliath and said, he's too big to kill. Right? And David looked at the light and said, he's too big to miss. I wonder what your perspective is, church. What's your perspective? Right? Because God says that this challenge in front of us oftentimes is an indication of the problem within us. Right? So what's David to do? Right? So David asked, so what do I get if I kill him? And Saul, right, King Saul says, does anybody even want to fight this guy? It's been 40 days. Right? How are we going to get past this? Right? So what happens? Right? King Saul keeps upping the ante. Right? Just like the airlines do. If they want you to, if you'll give up your seat on the flight, right? If you'll hold out with that, they'll keep upping the ante. They'll give you a $200 voucher. They'll come back and say, okay, it's $500 voucher. Oh, it's a $1,000 voucher if you'll just give up your seat. Right? They get desperate. Right? The more reward comes. And Saul has gotten desperate at this point in the story. Right? He says, listen, I'll give you my daughter in marriage. You don't have to pay taxes. So David's like, for real? Well, let's do this. Now here's the difference, that it could have been a whole lot different. Because David hadn't been out there for 40 days. Right? He hadn't gotten used to the dysfunction of the army. Right? He hadn't got used to standing there defeated and in deadlock like everybody else had. Right? But to David, it sounded different. It looked different. Right? Wait, he's not supposed to. Little David, chill out, dude. I'm not supposed to talk like that. Listen, church, if we're not careful, we can get comfortable in our dysfunction when we've been in it way too long. Maybe that's you. Right? That we can be so dysfunctional, we can do things for so long, right, that it just becomes the norm for us. And I just wonder, has Hickory Grove gotten comfortable in its dysfunction because it's been in it way too long? That's a hard question. Right? And I hope if you learned anything from me by now is that we're going to ask the hard questions. Right? Have we gotten too comfortable? Right? That's going to hold us back from moving forward. Right? David was like, hold on. Right? So he said, what about God? I get what if I kill him? Do we really do this? Right? And I want you to see that this is what always happens when God is trying to do something in our lives. Right? The enemy will always present another enemy that's not the real enemy to keep you distracted from fighting the one enemy you're called to defeat. Right? He'll distract us. He'll try all means, right, to distract us. In David's case, it was his brother. Right? His big brother. His name is Eliab. He was tall. Right? So for a minute, literally, Samuel thought he was supposed to be the king. Right? Because Saul's tall, and Samuel just saw Eliab and what he thought that that God would want to replace Saul with. Right? He was more focused on his height than his heart. And God said, don't look at his height, look at his heart. Right? So what does Eliab do? He starts going after David. He starts to try to judge his motives. Right? And in verse 28 of chapter 17, now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. Man, he's just trying to call David out. right? Straight up. Right? Now, all these things David had taken care of. We learn and we know that David was a pretty responsible young man. Right? But what's happening here is I believe the enemy is trying to trigger David to get him to fight the wrong person. Because watch. If he stands here and argues with his brother, he's never going to see the real enemy. And this may be the whole sermon for somebody today. Right? Just look straight ahead if you're married. Sometimes you're fighting against what you're supposed to be fighting for. Sometimes, right, man, we try to fight against anything and everything when there's certain things in our life that God has called us to that we must and we should be fighting for. Right? If David gets caught up fighting Goliath, he never even sees Goliath. Right? If he gets distracted, listen, some of us are defeated simply because we're distracted. Just because we've lost focus. Right? Hickory Grove, what are we letting distract us from the purpose God has for us? What are those things? Think about it. I mean, this is real stuff. This is real things. What did we let distract us from the purpose that God has for us? You're going to hear this from me. You've heard it already. We cannot let the mechanics of church get in the way of the mission of the church. As the leader here, right, whether that is spiritually, whether that is administratively, whether that is organizationally, structurally, however you want to see it, we absolutely cannot let the mechanics of church get in the way and stop the mission that God has planted on this church. Right? It's paramount. I've seen it so many times in churches, right? That, man, listen, and don't get me wrong. We will be good stewards of everything we do here. We are going to be organized and we're going to go about things the right way. You have my commitment on that. That's the only way I know how to do this. But if it gets in the way of us reaching people for Christ the way that this book says, we've got to change it. We've got to evaluate it. We've got to look at it different. We've got to see if there's a different way if we're doing it outside of that. Right? Listen, if we're getting distracted, we're not even going to get to Goliath. Right? We'll never get to the right insecurity oftentimes, right, that stirs up inside of us. Right? That's causing the issue. If we keep blaming people, if we keep blaming things. Right? Eliab wasn't the giant. Eliab wasn't the enemy. Eliab was his brother that he was supposed to fight for. Right? We've got to seize that opportunity. Right? Because if he stops and he argues with Eliab, again, he's going to miss Goliath. Right? Every story in this room is still being written. Right? And sometimes you think you know how it ends. But what if it's not over yet? What if it's not over yet? 2 or 3 years ago, I did not see my story being written this way. I can assure you. Right? But what is it? Right? What if it's not over yet? What if your best days are not behind you? Right? What if the devil is a liar? Right? What if everything that you've been through can serve a greater purpose? This is how we've got to look at this. This is how we've got to pursue this. Right? I believe God's a God of second chances, a third chances, a fourth chances. And when David showed up, what's he say to the giant? He says, I come against you in the name of the Lord. How are we coming to our battle? Right? Are we coming right to our battle? Says, I come against you with my preferences. Are we going to come to him in the name of the Lord? Right? It could have ended with David having a bad attitude, right? And just overseeing the ordinary. It could have ended when David was fighting against who he was supposed to be fighting for. right, if he didn't seize that opportunity. Number 3, David didn't stop at "you're only." Now, that doesn't make grammatical sense, does it? David didn't stop at "you're only." Do you know "you're only"? What is that? It's the spirit of lack of and limitation. Right? Because Saul says in this story, right? David started to show Saul his resume. He says, "Hey, I'm pretty good at beating stuff that's bigger than me, Saul. Right? I beat a lion one time. I beat a bear one time. Put me in, coach. I'm ready." And Saul says, "You're only a boy." What's "you're only"? Right? In verse 33, 17:33, and Saul said to David, "You're not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth. And he has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." That's pretty bold from a 17-year-old boy, don't you think? What's your only? What if we approach like this here at Hickory Grove, right? Hey, we're only a small little church in Mount Holly. We only have this amount of resources. We've only ever done this, or we've only ever done that. Church, I want to challenge us this morning not to get bogged down in "you're only." I thought before, right? Just a preacher. Like what if I got bogged down in that, in the lives that we can affect and the things that we can do here? Jeremiah, I love this. Jeremiah 1, verse 4 through 8. "Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying," all right, so God coming to Jeremiah, the great prophet, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Then I said, Ah, Lord God, behold, I do not know how to speak, for I am only a youth. But the Lord said to me, Do not say, I am only a youth. For to all whom I send you, you shall go, and whatever I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord." David simply says, hey, listen, I'm bringing the same God to this valley that I brought to the last valley. And he will deliver us. Hey, here's the common pattern I've noticed. Right? And this is what David's saying. He's like, I dropped the lion, I dropped the bear. It only stands for reason, right? That God's delivered me from those things. He's going to deliver me from the Philistine giant. I know how this story ends because I know who wrote it. And he's the perfecter of my faith. Right? Because we tell ourselves stories, but if God wrote it, it's not over, church, until we win. Right? It's not over till the light overcomes the darkness. Right? It could have been a whole lot different ending if David got bogged down in the ordinary. It could have been a whole lot different if David did not seize the opportunity and fight the real battle instead of his brother. It could have been a whole lot different if David started to look for excuses like his age to not conquer what God had put in front of him to conquer. Right? And I want to suggest maybe today that, because I know in church we talk about new beginnings a lot. Right? And what about new endings? What about new endings? What about to be continued? How about if we approach it from that way? What about the third day? What about Sunday morning? What about Jesus? I know how the story ends. So I see him on the cross, I'm not worried. Why? Because I know how that story ends. The disciples didn't know that. This is the challenge, right? To know how the story ends, even when you don't know how you're going to get there. That's my challenge today.